really hope that when you're spending your book buying dollars these days, you're doing it with independent community bookstores. The richest guy in the world does not need any more of your hard-earned bucks, but our local bookstores and our local communities really do. It's just as easy to get online and order from Bookworks or wherever you're at, your local bookstore. There are also independent bookstore websites where you can get on, and they will actually send you lists of bookstores you can order from. So with that said, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the book. There are many themes in Borderlands Boy, and so I can't possibly talk about all of them in a short period of time. It's a deeply personal book as a memoir, but it's also a kind of extended reflection on some of the main historical events in the last 70 years. Since time is limited, I've chosen a couple to focus on. First is the pervasive presence of violence, racism, and xenophobia in our world. Today, this is once again one of the major political issues in a way that I think it hasn't been since the 1960s and 70s. It's also the subject of most of my political activities, study, and teaching during my adult life. And since it's near the end of Pride Month, it's also a coming out story and a story about the struggle to come to terms with being gay in a homophobic world. There's a popular view that the post-war US in the 1950s was a kind of golden age, the greatest generation when the nation united around patriotism, community, small town values, peace and prosperity, and unchallenged world leadership. Those of you who are old enough to remember, like me, know that was not always true, especially if you are not a white, Christian, straight, middle or upper class male. I spent my early childhood in the 1950s living with my farm on a mushroom farm north of Denver. To me as a young child, it seemed like a paradise. That would soon change as I ventured out into the world and learned something about human hatred and violence. I never felt more joyous or free than when I was out on the farm with its towering cottonwood trees, asparagus and cornfields, and willow-lined ponds. When I started school, I felt as if I was wrenched away from my sense of security and my idyllic existence and thrust into a threatening new world. Although I had my brother to ride with me on the bus, as soon as we arrived at school and went our separate ways, I was terrified by the other kids, the teachers, the crowded playground, the cafeteria, and the principal, a man the size of my father, who walked around constantly shouting at us, "Stand up straight when you walk. Don't slouch like that. You're going to ruin your posture." I remember very little of the first couple of years of school, although a few incidents are seared into my memory. After picking up my brother and me on the highway near the farm, the school bus stops at the crest of Goat Hill before descending into the town of Westminster. On the side of the treeless hill are a collection of rural shacks where poor Mexican immigrant families live and raise goats. A handful of kids climb aboard the bus and shuffle into seats as close together as possible. Some of the boys have patched jeans, and the girls wear hand-me-down dresses and thin sweaters. A chorus of jeers goes up from the white kids on the bus. "Spicks, you smell like goats. What's the matter, no speak English?" The children remain silent, eyes downcast. I could not understand the reason for their mistreatment, but the aggression terrifies me, and I hunker down and pray that the bus will get to the school quickly. Another time, my brother and I are on the bus going home. He starts fighting with another boy for reasons I don't understand. They tumble out of the seats into the aisle, violently pounding each other. I think my brother's going to get killed. The bus driver, swearing, pulls over to the side of the road, grabs each boy by an arm and drags him off the bus. I jump down in a panic, and the bus pulls away, leaving the three of us standing there in the dust. I'm terrified and sobbing as I watch the other boy get up and silently limp away. A sudden awareness is born in me that I am not like other boys. I feel vulnerable and wonder if I'm nothing but a coward, unable to defend myself as my brother does. Within a few years, we moved from the farm to the Denver suburbs, and I became increasingly aware that I had a desperate secret in my life that I could not talk about to anyone. I had known from my earliest years I was attracted to boys, not girls, and that there were other boys who were willing to explore sex with me. But did that mean I was homosexual? And if so, what did that portend for my future? What happened to you if you were found out? Would you get locked up in prison or the state mental hospital in Pueblo, a grim-faced fortress that I had seen from the highway when we had gone to visit relatives in southern Colorado? And why didn't anybody ever talk about this stuff? I didn't know where to look for answers, and I was not about to raise those questions with any adults. Having lived now for almost half a century as an open, proud gay man, it's hard for me to imagine the grip of homophobia on the society in which I grew up. While it's true that some LGBT people in those days found ways to live fulfilling private lives and create loving relationships, even for the lucky ones, there was a high price to pay in the secrecy and separation of public and private lives. For the unlucky, the consequences of being publicly branded homosexual or lesbian could be catastrophic and sometimes fatal. There were no role models, no places to turn for information or sympathy, not even our families, pastors, or doctors. In that atmosphere of secrecy and repression, the compelling search for others of our kind was fraught with danger. Fortunately, in junior high school, I met a boy a couple years older than me, and we soon became not only best friends, but sexual partners through most of our high school years. I truly loved Rick and felt his affection and support for me. I've always been grateful that I had a caring sexual companion at a time when I was struggling so much with myself in the sexually repressive early 60s. I was still going to church and regularly working to understand my sexuality. One time I asked Rick if what we were doing was sinful. He replied seriously, "Well, yes, it is a sin for sure. But in my church, as long as I tell the priest about it in confession and do my penance, it's not a sin anymore." I was shocked and horrified. "You talk to a priest about what we do? Are you crazy? He'll tell your mother and she'll tell my father and he'll put us in jail if he doesn't kill us first." Rick laughed at my alarm. "No, that's not the way it works. He's a priest. He can't tell anybody what he hears." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to give up on the sex either. So I simply took my anxiety up another notch, and we didn't talk about the subject again. That relationship ended when I went off to college and Rick moved to another state. Being in the university in the middle 1960s was one of the greatest experiences of my life. I did a 180-degree turn from my conservative Republican upbringing. And I studied with some young radical professors who were challenging both the traditional conservative and liberal interpretations of American history. But I also went deeply into the closet, desperately hoping I could bury my painful secret and try to appear to live a normal life. At that time, it was still not safe to be open, even in the radical university world. A couple of stories from those years. A classmate I knew from the history department one day picked up a young sailor in the men's room of the Greyhound bus station in Denver. After having sex in the back seat of the student's car, the sailor pulled a knife and stabbed him to death. It was highly sensationalized by the press in Denver, and the general sentiment was that the sailor was the victim, acting in self-defense against a sexual predator who got exactly what he deserved. For gay men like me, It was a clear and powerful message that our sexuality put us at risk. In 1968, I joined the presidential campaign of Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war candidate who opposed Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. I volunteered to canvass voters in the Democratic primary in Nebraska, along with a group of my college friends. The day we arrived, we got a rousing pep talk from a handsome young Ivy League graduate student who was one of the campaign coordinators. We were making history, he assured us, as part of the largest student grassroots movement ever in a presidential election. Our job was not to push McCarthy's platform on them, but to ask them what their issues and concerns were, then share our own beliefs openly and positively, and try to relate to them on a personal level. Don't just mouth campaign slogans. Be yourself and talk honestly about your lives and values. This is not Gene McCarthy's campaign, it's yours. Be the genuine thing and they'll respect you even if they disagree with you. Then he added, you should know that there are only two things that we don't tolerate in this campaign: drugs and homosexuality. Those words hit me like a blow to the gut. I had an impulse to turn around and go home, but I told myself it was an important cause that I believed in. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was not welcome as part of the group and couldn't trust my companions. I graduated from college in 1969, the year of the largest call-up of draftees to be sent to Vietnam. Like almost every other male in my class, I faced an agonizing decision about going to fight in a war I did not support. In January of 1970, I received the letter I'd been dreading, ordering me to report to the induction center in Denver for a draft physical. There was now no avoiding the issue. I ran through my limited alternatives once again with new clarity and decisiveness. I was not a martyr or a saint. If I failed the physical, I would be happy to go on and live my life. But if I passed the exam, I knew I could flee the country. But a strong voice inside told me that no government had the right to force me to choose between my country and my conscience. Nor could I be forced to fight and kill people in a war that I did not believe in. At that point, it hit me that I had already made my decision without even realizing it. If drafted, I would refuse and go and face a prison term. I'd struggled for a long time with the question of whether I possessed the courage to stand up for my beliefs. Now I knew I had no choice. That moment of clarity brought with it a shock wave of fear, but also a great sense of liberation. I no longer had to wrestle with my conscience, and I could concentrate on mustering my strength for whatever life had in store for me. I know of no more intimidating experience than being a defendant in a federal criminal trial. The courtrooms, like great cathedrals or Puritan churches, are designed to emphasize the power and majesty of the law and diminish the significance of the individuals who've challenged it. The judge sat high above everyone in the courtroom with its towering walls of dark-stained wood panels beneath a vaulted ceiling. Even the name of the case, as it was called by the bailiff, sent a daunting message. The United States of America v. Carpenter. Really? The entire United States against me? All 280 million of them? It was frightening, but at the same time exhilarating. Could what I was doing be so momentous and threatening that the entire weight of the federal legal system must be brought against me? I suddenly found myself feeling proud to be in that courtroom. With all its power, they could punish me and take away my freedom, but they could not force me to do anything against my own will and conscience. I had the greater power in the situation, and I felt strong, my anxiety melting away. I knew I'd turned a corner, and I would never be the same person again. I was beginning to learn what rebels and dissenters had discovered throughout the centuries of struggle. that when you face your greatest fears, if you survive, fear does not disappear, nor does the power of evil to impact our lives. But the difference is that you now realize your great power lies in being able to choose how you can act with grace and integrity in the face of those realities. I served 14 months in federal prisons in Oklahoma and Texas, where I received a postgraduate crash course in human violence, inequality, and oppression. The worst of several violent outbreaks I witnessed erupted suddenly on a simmering hot afternoon, just as I was leaving my classroom. A large group of Black inmates suddenly appeared at one end of the exercise fields and faced off with a group of Hispanics. Guards rushed in to intervene, but the two groups were already clashing. Sirens went off, and the guards rushing toward the melee were attacked by inmates, as were the guards in dormitories when they tried to lock the residents inside. I could smell smoke as I ran across the yard toward my dorm and saw several small fights breaking out along the way. Some inmates were smashing windows or throwing around furniture and weightlifting equipment. Others panicked, not knowing which way to head for safety. Several of us made it back to our building, but it was locked. We pounded on the door, and finally a frightened guard admitted us. Once inside, we hunkered down from the breaking windows, listening to the commotions outside as they webbed and flowed. The response by the guards was swift and brutal. The fighting probably lasted less than an hour, but it seemed much longer. Finally, our doors were opened to admit a squad of riflemen wearing bulletproof armor, helmets, and gas masks. We were ordered to strip off our clothing and marched out the door. Once outside, we were lined up and told to lie face down in the grass, hands locked behind our heads. We stayed that way as the guards moved down the line, ordering us to stand one at a time for full body inspection, and then resume a squatting position, still with our hands behind our heads. As I stood, I looked around and saw hundreds of men in similar rows, surrounded by guards in full military riot gear. I was appalled at the violence I had seen, but just as appalled by the dehumanization of naked human beings at the hands of these faceless robotic figures moving among us. I thought, this is what fascism looks like. It's a vision I'll never forget, and it still evokes for me the same profound dread and anxiety I felt in seeing films of World War II concentration camp victims, young Chileans in the sports stadiums where they were taken to be tortured, raped, and murdered, military forces pushing desperate immigrants back away from fences in Southern Europe or our own Mexican border, or witnessing the police in our communities still these days beating peaceful protesters in the streets. But I also had some of the most profound and life-transforming experiences in that prison pressure cooker. The intense relationships I developed with a few of my fellow prisoners convinced me for the first time that men could love and nurture each other, even in the most dangerous and harsh situations. That was totally contrary to the masculine myths I had grown up with, where men might be friendly with one another, but male relationships were by nature competitive, a struggle to determine who was dominant. In my college years, I had feared that I would have to make a choice between my sexual attraction to men and my desire for a stable, warm, and loving family. The gay curse meant that you could not have both. Now I knew that was a pernicious lie, intended to make us hate ourselves or self-destroy. My small circle of prison brothers loved and took care of each other, although the issue of sexuality was never raised among us. I was beginning to imagine another possible world in which I might have both sexual fulfillment and love with other men. At first, what seemed like the effeminate and over-the-top behavior of some of the homosexual or transgendered prisoners made me uncomfortable. I told myself I was not like them, and being gay didn't make me any less of a man. But I feared that if I came out, everyone would associate me with them. Some of the other prisoners taunted them mercilessly. Others pretended to flirt jokingly, but most simply avoided and dismissed them contemptuously. Some supposedly straight men covertly used or abused them sexually. The guards also reacted to them with scorn. The stigma attached to not acting like a normal man was overwhelming. Over time, my perceptions began to change as I got to know some of the gay and trans people. Many of them were intelligent and sophisticated, especially about cultural issues. Some were brilliant comedians using parody, satire, irony, and sarcasm to skewer conventional opinions and behaviors and put down their tormentors. I also noticed they supported and took care of each other in the face of constant insults, threats, and disgust that the prisoners heaped on them. It finally dawned on me that they were openly challenging the fundamental validity of traditional, rigid notions of masculine and feminine behavior, undermining them with humor and insight rather than confronting them directly. They were by and large the most courageous people I've ever known, conducting a nonviolent frontal assault on the most powerful taboos ingrained in boys and men in our society. I felt humbled and ashamed of my fear and secretiveness, my failure to assert and fight for my own identity as they did. For the first time, I began to understand that the real sexual revolution would never happen until men could change our notions of masculinity. I learned that even in prison, some inmates found ways to develop relationships of love and sexual intimacy with each other. I knew that I did not yet have the courage or poise to do what they did, but I resolved that on my release, I was going to start my coming out journey. For me, resisting the draft and my prison experience, awful as it was, strengthened and gave me the personal confidence to realize that if I could stand up to the US government, survive, grow, and learn to love other men in prison, that I had the courage to take on the even greater challenge of accepting my own sexuality and demanding that others accept it also. Coming out of prison, I kept my promises to myself. I eventually found work as a counselor in the LGBT community in Austin, Texas, and later as a peace and human rights activist for the Quaker organization American Friends Service Committee. I eventually returned to the academic world and became a teacher. I want to close with just a few brief reflections from the book on today's budding political and cultural renewal in our country, which I think is quite unlike anything we've seen since the years of my youth. I've spent many years of my life struggling against three closely interrelated challenges that face humankind: our acceptance of gross inequalities of wealth, power, and rights among individuals, social groups, and nations, our wanton destruction of our natural world, and our willingness to turn so easily to violence and competition rather than following our natural instincts toward compassion and cooperation and solving our shared human problems. These are not only our most pressing political, economic, and social issues, but our most fundamental moral and ethical challenges. I see resonances to my own personal experiences and our national history in the current students I teach at the University of New Mexico. In the way the eloquent young survivors from Parkland High School have transformed the debates about gun violence in America, the powerful new human rights movements led by Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the Dreamer Generation, gay, lesbian, and transgender activists, the courageous women athletes of the US gymnastics team who came forward about sexual assaults, and the diverse young people who've been energized to run for political office by opposition to Trumpism. It is these younger generations who have the most at stake because they will live with the future consequences of the world we create. Elders like us need to listen to them, support them with love and respect, and gently remind them that there are long traditions of past struggles for human rights, dignity, and equality to draw strength from. But above all, we need to realize the last thing they need is for us to be telling them how they should go about their own struggles for a better world. Thank you.